On a cold December night in 2003, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jonathan Luna vanished under circumstances that have puzzled investigators for over 2 decades. The next morning, his body was discovered face down in a remote Pennsylvania creek with 36 stab wounds and a trail of blood that stretched for miles. Yet, despite the brutal nature of his death, the official story has never quite made sense. Why was Jonathan driving alone that night? Why did he abandon his phone and glasses, items he depended on daily? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why was his death been shrouded in confusion, with authorities torn between calling it a homicide or a man simply choosing to take his own life? In this video, we're going to unravel the strange timeline of Jonathan Luna's final hours, examine the discrepancies that don't add up, and explore the unsettling theories that surround this unsolved case. Because when it comes to Jonathan's death, the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley and this is Heebie-Jeebies TV. This is where true crime meets the other side. Now, in today's story, we're going to talk about a very strange and unusual case, and it's the story of Jonathan Luna. And you'll see as we get into the story that a lot of these things simply don't add up. And the more you look into it, the more confused you get and the more questions you start forming inside of your head. So this is going to be a bit of a longer story, so let's get right into the video. Jonathan was born on October 21st of 1965 in the Bronx, New York. He was born to a Filipino father named Paul Luna and an African-American mother named Rosa Cela. He also had an older brother. Together, all four of them lived in the Bronx, New York, where Jonathan would go on to be raised. Now, not a ton is known about his childhood other than, of course, that he had a sibling. And from a very young age, he was a huge Yankees fan. As he began school, it was very obvious to his parents and teachers that Jonathan was a very, very smart kid, and some would even say that he was gifted. Now, Jonathan had really big dreams. From a very young age, he initially said that he wanted to pursue journalism, but by the time he got to high school, that had completely changed, and he said that he now wanted to become a lawyer. He was accepted into the Fordham University, where he completed his bachelor's degree, and from there he went on to attend law school at the University of North Carolina. But not only was Jonathan fulfilling one dream here of becoming a lawyer, he also would be fulfilling another one, and this is where he would actually go on to meet his future wife. Now, her name was Angela Hopkins, and she was also a very smart student. She was a medical student, and eventually she would go on to become an obstetrician. In 1993, the couple would go on to get married, and together they had two beautiful boys. The family stayed in New York for a little bit. Specifically, they were living in Brooklyn. But Jonathan ended up taking a new job, a position as the Assistant United States Attorney, which then required the family to pack up their things and move to Baltimore, Maryland in 1999. So with a brand new job, he was making a lot more money. His wife, also being a doctor, was extremely helpful. The family was doing pretty well for themselves, so much so that he was able to provide for his extended family. They had invited his mother-in-law to live at the family home so she could also spend time with her grandchildren, but he had also bought an apartment for his parents nearby. After all, it just really seemed like being a close-knit family was a priority for everyone here because, as you know, it truly does take a village to raise a family. Now, at this new job, Jonathan was handling some very big and serious cases, some cases revolving around child porn and illegal substances. Now, a lot of people would not necessarily be able to handle this, at least emotionally. It takes a very special type of person to be able to work on these cases and not let it consume them with just a lot of dark and negative thoughts. But Jonathan was the complete opposite. He was a very, very good lawyer. He was a professional. People said that he always maintained his vivacious personality and described him as being peppy, excited, and full of vigor. He was always ready to do his job and to do it to the best of his ability. However, in 2003, Jonathan ran into some trouble at work. Now, I'm sure we've all experienced this. We've all had tension in the workplace. We've all run into 1, 2, 3 different colleagues that we've had tension with, maybe not all at the same place, but over our careers, I'm sure this is something that we can all relate to. However, in this instance, it was his boss that he was not getting along with, and his name was Thomas DiBaggio. The problems and the tension grew so much, it got to the point where Jonathan seriously believed that his job was on the line. He was extremely worried that he was going to get fired, so he even hired a lawyer to help him navigate through this situation. While Jonathan and his boss had been working together since 2001, it wasn't until 2003 when things finally reached a boiling point due to a case that Jonathan was working on. So in 2003, Jonathan was handling a very large case. Specifically, it had to do with a bank robbery. But then something very unexpected happened during the trial and the investigation period. So you see, authorities had managed to retrieve a large sum of money, approximately $36,000, and it had gone missing from the evidence locker where it was safely stashed. And surprisingly, the attention went right to Jonathan, so much so that he had even been scheduled to take a lie detector test if he had anything to do with the missing money. But before that could happen, tragedy struck. So in this drug case that he was also working on, there was some things that were not really going well. The case wasn't being handled to the best of their ability. Certain information had not been turned over from the prosecution to the defense attorney. Specifically, it had to do with a key witness from the government side or an informant who had changed their testimony and now was no longer cooperating. Now, because of this, on December 3rd, 2003, Jonathan reached out to the defense attorneys on the case and offered a plea deal. The defense attorneys accepted this plea deal, but they also wanted to discuss the details a little bit further. So everyone involved contacted the judge on the case, told them that they wanted to discuss a plea deal. And so therefore, the trial was suspended for a day to allow the attorneys to hash out the details. That evening, Jonathan left the office and then went home for dinner, but he went back to work after that to continue working on the case. Around 9 p.m., he spoke with one of the defense attorneys, telling him that he was finalizing the paperwork and that he would be faxing it over shortly, but most likely before midnight. However, that never happened. Now, what happens next is based on several electronic recordings, electronic trackers that the investigation revealed. At 11:38 p.m., his silver 1999 Honda Accord is seen leaving the parking garage of his workplace. 10 minutes later, at 11:49 p.m., his car is seen passing through the Fort McHenry Toll Plaza on Interstate 95. At 12:46 a.m., he reaches the Delaware Line Toll Plaza. At 12:57 a.m., he is seen using his debit card to withdraw $200 at an ATM in the JFK Plaza in Newark, Delaware. For the next hour and a half, we don't know where he went or what he did. And he's not recorded again until 2:37 a.m. when he accesses the New Jersey Turnpike. And then again at 2:47 a.m., he is seen accessing the Pennsylvania Turnpike. At 3:20 a.m., his debit card is used once again to buy gas at a station in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. Then at 4:04 a.m., his car is seen exiting the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Finally, at 5:30 a.m., it all comes to an end when an employee of a well drilling company made a horrifying discovery. It was near Denver, Pennsylvania, when this employee noticed a very unusual scene in the back area of the workplace. He noticed that there was a car parked back there in a forested ravine type of area. He also said that he noticed the flashing red light from the car. He thought this was really odd, so he approached it carefully in order to examine the situation. The front end was hanging over a creek. Then he noticed that the driver's side of the door and the front fender on the left side had blood smears on them. But then he took a look underneath the car, and that's when he noticed that there was a body. It was the body of Jonathan Luna, and he was facing down. So here, I'm sure you guys are having a lot of questions. I know I definitely did when I was trying to put this entire case together. Immediately, my mind starts to look at the different states that he was going to. He drove from Baltimore, Maryland to New Jersey and Pennsylvania. It kind of seemed like he was going all over the place with no clear destination. Now, I understand that Pennsylvania and New Jersey are considered to be part of the Philadelphia tri-state area, meaning that a lot of people go between these states quite often, whether it's for work. Some people work in one state, they live in another state, they have business going on in multiple states because they're just so close together and easily accessible. But from Baltimore, in my opinion, it seemed like it was a little bit of a trek. So I had a lot of questions. For example, where was he really going and why go through so many hoops to get there? Was he alone the entire time? What connection did he have to where he ended up in Denver, Pennsylvania? What was he doing during those extended gaps that we have no information on? Certain distances took much longer than they should have, which leads me to wonder why. Did he stop somewhere that we don't necessarily know about yet? So as we move on to the investigation, the authorities were called to the scene right away, and it was very obvious to them that Jonathan suffered. He did not have an easy death. At the scene, the pathologist discovered that he had been stabbed 36 times to the neck, shoulders, and back, but his actual cause of death was from drowning in the creek below his car. He also noted a traumatic wound to the right side of his head. The initial ruling by this coroner determined that this was a homicide and that Jonathan likely suffered a torturous death, judging by all the wounds on his body, in an attempt to extract information from him. However, there was one really important thing that stood out from all of these stab wounds. Now, while he did have 36 official wounds to him, the coroner said that a lot of these were very shallow or superficial wounds. There were a few stab wounds that were deep enough to cause death, though. When they took a look inside of his car, they found blood. They found a pool of blood in the back area of his car. And they also found some blood on a toll booth ticket from his toll exit at 4:04 a.m., suggesting that by this point he had already been injured. Authorities also discovered his wallet and the $200 that he had taken out from the ATM, and it had all been scattered inside of his car. And a search was done for the murder weapon in the surrounding area, but nothing was found. Not right away, at least. When they went back to his office, they discovered that he had left behind his glasses, which he needed to drive, and they also found his cell phone on his desk. Now, a majority of people would never leave their office or their home with these two things behind, especially if you need your glasses to drive. I mean, if you need your glasses to drive and you are going out for a late night drive, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to see. If you have a hard time seeing during the day without your glasses, it's going to be almost impossible for you to drive at night without them. And as for a cell phone, maybe back in 2003, people were not as attached to cell phones. I'm just trying to think in my mind where we were at in 2003. That was right around the beginning where cell phones were coming out. They weren't as technologically advanced as they are today. I remember most people used them just to make phone calls, maybe to text here and there, but you couldn't really spend hours on your phone playing games, going on social media platforms. That wasn't fully developed yet. So him leaving behind his cell phone to me is a little bit more likely than him forgetting his glasses. I mean, if there was an emergency, I could see that being a bit of an issue, but I don't remember people being super attached to their cell phones back then as we are today. But anyways, the point here that I'm trying to make is what would make him leave in such a hurry that he would forget two pretty important items behind. The following day, a second autopsy was done, and it was done by a different coroner, and he also determined that this was definitely a homicide. He believed that Jonathan was still alive when he was placed in the creek and that he had passed away due to drowning. He also pointed out several deep cuts that caused internal hemorrhaging. Then there was a dispute about defensive wounds. A news article reported that they were told that Jonathan had defensive wounds all over his hands. A police officer that was also on the scene did confirm this, and he said that his hands appeared to be shredded, like he definitely put up a fierce fight. However, the coroner would later go on to say that he did not observe any defensive wounds and that all stab wounds were to his neck and upper shoulder area. I don't know about you, but to me, this is a pretty big discrepancy. I mean, how could a coroner not notice someone's hands being completely shredded? Like, I can understand maybe he missed a nick here, maybe a nick there. But for a police officer to say that the hands appeared to be completely shredded and then the coroner just completely brushes this off, that is a pretty big discrepancy in my opinion. But then there was also another wound that was pretty important. It was to his genital area. There was a large cut in that region, and the coroner explained that it was possibly made by accident during his autopsy, but we don't actually know whether or not this came from the autopsy or if he had been stabbed there. Then, almost 2 months later, in February of 2004, authorities announced that they had found a penknife in the area that they had not found in the initial search. However, it was not made clear when this discovery was made. It was then suggested that this penknife was likely the weapon used to injure Jonathan. Now, obviously, this definitely looks like it's heading towards this being a homicide. It was very messy. He had a lot of stab wounds. Someone certainly did this to Jonathan, right? I mean, that's what I was thinking, and that's what a lot of other people were thinking as well. That is until the authorities started doing some digging into Jonathan's life, and then they presented an alternative theory that Jonathan did this to himself. I know this is completely shocking to hear. Like I said, I believe that this was definitely a homicide. However, when I heard this, I was very shocked, and it reminded me a lot of the Ellen Greenberg case. Now, if you don't know what happened to her, her case has also been very highly publicized. It's very controversial because of the circumstances. Essentially, she was stabbed 20 times in her back area, but her passing was also ruled as her having done it to herself, which was completely insane. I mean, a lot of the stab wounds on her body were not even possible for her to do herself. And authorities were adamant that this is what happened, that there was no sign of anyone breaking into her apartment and that she had just done this to herself. Of course, the public was not going to accept this decision. There has been so much outcry regarding her case, so much so that it was now being reinvestigated, I believe in early 2025. All that to say that this is the same feeling that I got when I was going through Jonathan's story. It just seemed like there was something fishy going on. There's no way he would have done that to himself. Although the wounds on Jonathan's body, I will say that they were all on the frontal part of his body, which were accessible and were easy for him to reach to. He was still stabbed 36 times. Why would anyone want to do that to themselves? I mean, you have to also know that you have to fight through each pain that you are inflicting on yourself. Not only are you fighting through that physical pain, but your brain is probably also fighting yourself as well, telling yourself not to do this. You're hurting yourself. So you also have to bypass that safety mechanism. And then when you also consider that potential stab wound to his genital area, It just seems very unlikely that he would do that to himself on purpose. And then you also have to consider the idea that if he actually did want to take his own life, why would he do it this way? There are so many other painless or at least less painful ways to do this. So personally, this was not making a lot of sense to me. But according to the authorities, they suggested that these shallow wounds were not signs of torture, but actually hesitation wounds, as if he were trying to take his own life but then got scared at the last moment. And the reason authorities put this theory forward was because of a few things they discovered during the investigation. Now, the first few things that they discovered were that Jonathan had a credit card debt of $25,000 spread out through multiple credit cards. And they also found multiple dating profiles of his. They theorized that his personal life was in shambles, which then led to poor performance at work, which then further stressed the situation, possibly to the point where he was making some serious mistakes that were getting him into trouble with his superiors. Investigators were also looking into a loan application that was done for about $30,000, but it was then canceled shortly after the $36,000 from the case he was working on disappeared, suggesting that Jonathan was the one responsible for taking this money because the clues were just pointing to the idea that he was suffering with money problems. And once he got his hand on these $36,000, he no longer needed the loan application. But I will say that none of this was ever proven. But all of this was heavily questioned when it was announced that the investigation revealed that there was blood DNA found in Jonathan's car from a second person. There was also speculation that he had bought gas not just for his car that night, but for another car as well. However, the authorities never confirmed this publicly. What they did claim, though, is that Jonathan was alone that night, but they didn't explain how they knew this, which left the public to wonder if the authorities had their hands on video surveillance footage that they were just keeping to themselves at this point. And as for his dating profiles, it was mentioned that they were actually from 1997, but again, this was never fully confirmed. But then there was another bombshell that authorities just could not explain, and in my opinion, really messes with their theory that Jonathan did this to himself. About 4 hours after his body had been discovered, his credit card was used at a mall in the King of Prussia area. They were never able to confirm who used it or who had taken it from him. But that did lead to more questions. So did that mean that he was with someone that night? I mean, there were more questions than answers at this point. Obviously, who took his card? Who was this person? Was this person caught on video footage using his card? Were they with him that night, or did they take it from him on a different day? His wife, Angela, never spoke to the press, at least no one that we know of. However, his friends and family certainly did. They vehemently denied that Jonathan would ever cheat on his wife. They were adamant that the two of them were very much in love with each other. They didn't have any problems, and Jonathan was just not the kind of guy that would allow himself to get into an unsurmountable amount of debt, let alone try to take his own life. His father also spoke out. He said that Jonathan, in the time leading up to his passing, had spoken about having to do with a case in Pennsylvania, which is why he had to go there back and forth quite a bit. But when the authorities looked into this, his work said that he was not working on a case that had anything to do with Pennsylvania. So when it came to them, he had no reason to go there. So what was the reason for him having to go there? No one has been able to explain this. But even with all of these inconsistencies, I mean, the FBI was really trying to make everyone believe that Jonathan certainly did this to himself. But there was just way too many inconsistencies. There were too many gaps in the story here. But regardless of all that, they were still pressuring the coroner to change his ruling from a homicide to Jonathan doing this to himself. But thankfully, the coroner did not cave into the pressure and he stood by his ruling. But when that didn't work, the FBI then put another theory forward, that Jonathan was attempting to stage his own kidnapping and unfortunately accidentally killed himself while doing it. However, they left the motive very unclear and up for speculation. Is it possible that Jonathan was trying to get himself out of the troubled situation that he was supposedly in by faking his own kidnapping? To me, it just seems like it's a lot of trouble to go through and a lot of unnecessary pain as well. To Jonathan's friends and family, it seemed like there was very little interest in finding out what had actually happened to Jonathan. I mean, I totally understand where they are coming from. To hear that your loved one was stabbed 36 times and then to hear or have it be suggested that they voluntarily did this to themselves sounds absolutely ridiculous. And this naturally led them to believe that maybe there was some sort of cover-up going on. The family hired a private investigator, and his name was Ed Martino, and he concluded that Jonathan was likely taken out by a corrupt federal agent. But why? He claimed that he had spent time with the second coroner and that this man was terrified and worried about his well-being. He explained that they both knew this wasn't a matter of Jonathan taking his own life, that it was definitely a homicide, but that the coroner had been told to stay quiet and that he had received pressure to change his findings. Although we don't know exactly why an FBI agent would want to do this to Jonathan, everyone seems to believe that maybe it had something to do with one of the cases he was working on, but again, we have no idea if this is true, let alone which case it could be related to. Furthermore, in 2021, records relating to Jonathan's case were ordered by the court to remain sealed, which obviously caught the interest of the public. Why would records on a case from 2003 be ordered to remain sealed? It made a lot of people ask questions. It made them wonder if the government or the court was trying to keep a secret from them. What were they trying to hide? However, when the judge was questioned on this, he simply stated that releasing this information on a case that is technically still ongoing could be detrimental to the case itself. So let's talk about the attacker. If we look at this case from the perspective that Jonathan did not do this to himself, then who did? Who would want to hurt Jonathan? Was it someone related to a case he was working on? Was it a form of revenge? Possibly. After all, as an attorney for the state, Jonathan was responsible for putting away a lot of bad guys. I can definitely see people that are related to these people that he put away wanting some sort of revenge, or these people themselves wanting revenge and using their connections from the prison to make sure that gets done. It could definitely explain the amount of stab wounds. I mean, usually people that are a victim of circumstance will receive a handful of stab wounds, sometimes just one, but 36 stab wounds suggests that there was something personal there, like some sort of passion. Then we also have the question of whether or not it was someone related to a case who wanted information from him. Again, it's possible, since the coroner theorized that with so many shallow wounds, it looked like he had been tortured for information. And then when you add in the cut on his genital area, it certainly makes that argument stronger. And then you also have to look at the pool of blood that was found in the backseat of his car. Is this possibly where he had been held, tortured, and the blood there was just a result of that? Or was it someone just completely random? Was it a random attempt at a carjacking? Was he in the wrong place at the wrong time? Was he a victim of circumstance? Anything is possible, but if this was some sort of theft gone wrong, why would this person leave behind the $200 after taking Jonathan's life? Or if they wanted the car, why would they leave the car there behind after taking Jonathan's life? It just doesn't fully make sense either. It was speculated that during the time gaps from the night of his murder, that he may have had car trouble and pulled over on the side of the road. The idea was presented that he may have encountered someone that offered to help him, but actually turned out to be his assailant. I can definitely see this being a possibility, but it doesn't explain why he left his office in a hurry that night. So let's say the reason Jonathan left his office early that day was because he was meeting with an FBI agent and they were supposed to talk about something important, possibly related to one of the cases he was working on. And let's say during this meeting, something went wrong. Maybe someone threatened the other, maybe they got into a heated argument. My question is, wouldn't someone like an FBI agent be more prepared for situations like this? Wouldn't they be more prepared for very dangerous situations, if you know what I mean? Wouldn't they have a bit more knowledge on how to take somebody out without leaving a huge mess behind? But let's say someone was hired on behalf of an FBI agent or hired on behalf of someone that Jonathan had incarcerated, someone that was seeking revenge and had hired a hitman. Wouldn't their entire job revolve around making sure this was executed flawlessly? I mean, why rely on using something like a penknife to do the deed? I mean, it seemed like they definitely struggled considering a lot of the wounds were shallow. Something like that is not necessarily guaranteed to get the job done. So if this was a professional hit, I have a hard time imagining them going to do this without any of their own equipment and then leaving a huge mess behind. To me, after going through everything, it really seemed like this was completely unplanned. It seemed like whatever happened in the moment. He was not expecting this to happen here, like a fight possibly broke out, leaving the assailant to use whatever they could get their hands on, and that just happened to be a penknife that was in Jonathan's car. However, when it comes to him leaving the office in a hurry, I don't know. There are many different theories out there that could explain why he left. Maybe he was meeting up with an informant. Maybe he was meeting up with an FBI agent. Maybe he was having an affair. Maybe these two events had nothing to do with one another and unfortunately are now linked together because of what ended up happening. I'm sure you guys can see by this point that a lot of the information simply does not make sense, and clearly there are a lot of pieces missing. And sadly, that is where the case remains to this day. We still have no clue who did this to Jonathan, why his life was taken from him, let alone what happened that night or why someone would want to do this to him. And tragically, both his parents did pass away without ever knowing what happened to their son. As for his wife and children, we don't have much information on them. Again, she has never spoken publicly to the media about what happened to Jonathan. So if you guys have any information about what happened to Jonathan that night, I'm going to put some information in the description box as always. And let me know what you guys think happened. Which theory are you leaning towards? I know this case is super confusing, but I hope you guys can understand what I meant by how nonsensical it all really is. All right, guys, that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one.